The fire danced like devils on my porch as I stood barefoot in the street, watching my house collapse. I could still hear the snap of timber and the hiss of vinyl siding melting like wax. The air reeked of smoke and gasoline. I wasn't crying. Not because I didn't feel anything, but because I had something far worse boiling inside. Rage. Let me back up. My name's Fletcher Ames. I moved into this quiet cul-de-sac in Cypress Ridge 3 months ago. I bought the only house on the block that wasn't part of the HOA grandfathered out of it decades ago. I liked it that way. Freedom tasted better than any painted curb or overpriced mailbox. Karren Prescott, the president of the HOA, did not agree. She was one of those women who always had a clipboard, a fake smile, and a voice that made your ears clench. Her blonde bob haircut hadn't changed since the Clinton era, and she wore pastel cardigans like armor. From the day I moved in, Karren had it out for me. "You really should consider joining the HOA, Mr. Ames," she told me the first week, standing at my doorstep with a pamphlet and a tray of cookies that smelled like they came from a box. "It's for the good of the community." "No, thanks," I said, taking the cookies and shutting the door before she could get another word in. That didn't sit well with her. The fines started appearing anyway, phony ones. Unapproved lawn ornaments. Mailbox 1.2 inches too short. I ignored them. Then came the citations for excessive noise when I wasn't even home. And the cherry on top, she had the gall to send a letter threatening to put a lien on my property. I sent back a letter of my own. It contained just 2 words, "Try me." I guess she did. A neighbor's doorbell cam caught them the HOA treasurer, some wannabe contractor named Rick Mullins, and Karren herself sneaking across my lawn at night with gas cans. I was working late when it happened. By the time I got home, my house was an inferno. Firefighters were already there, but it was too far gone. "Electrical fire," Karren said the next day, standing behind the yellow tape with the fakest expression of concern I've ever seen. "So sorry, Fletcher." "Maybe if you'd had the HOA's approved contractor inspect, save it," I said, stepping around her. "You made a mistake." "Oh," she asked, eyes narrowing. "And what mistake would that be?" I turned to her slowly. "You burned down the home of a federal judge," she blinked. "I'm Judge Fletcher Ames, United States District Court, and you just committed arson." Detective Marla Jimenez arrived less than an hour after I made the call. She didn't say much when she stepped over the ashes, her boots crunching on the soot-covered remains of what used to be my porch. Her dark eyes scanned everything: the charred mailbox post, the scorched garden gnomes, the twisted remnants of my front door, like she was cataloging a crime scene in her head before even pulling out a notepad. "Judge Ames," she said with a nod. "You weren't home during the incident?" I was in chambers until close to midnight. My neighbors across the street have a wide-angle camera feed. Time-stamped, motion-triggered, caught 2 people in hoodies carrying gas cans. One of them drops a lighter. "You'll want to review it," she raised an eyebrow. "You have the footage." "I've already made 3 copies. One on a thumb drive for you, one for the ATF, and one for the Department of Justice Internal Affairs Unit. Just in case this thing has legs." Marla didn't flinch. She'd seen worse, probably. But I noticed the way her mouth tightened when she slid the drive into her coat pocket. "No idea who the suspects are?" she asked, still keeping things neutral. "I don't speculate," I said, "but I'm sure your lab will be interested in the fingerprints left on my back fence gate." It was shoved open hard enough to crack the hinge. "I haven't touched it, neither have the firemen." "We'll get the techs on it," she said, already stepping away, calling in for a CSU team. While they got to work, I walked across the street to the only neighbor who'd ever minded their own business, Mr. Conway. Retired lineman, spent his days on the porch, listening to classic rock under a battered sun hat. He handed me a hot coffee without a word. "Strong enough to take the edge off my nerves. You see them?" I asked. He nodded slightly. "Didn't think they'd go that far, thought it was just more of their little hissy fits." "Did you recognize them?" "Didn't need to. One of them tripped over my son's skateboard on the sidewalk." Hoodie flew back. It was Rick Mullins. I'd bet my pension on it. I looked at him. You willing to make a statement? I already called the station, he said, sipping from his enamel mug. Told him everything, not just what I saw, what I heard. They were laughing. One of them said, that'll teach him to act like he's better than us. I clenched my jaw, not because of the words, but because the arrogance behind them. The entitlement. They thought they could destroy a man's home over a grudge and walk away clean. I didn't go back to the ash pile that night. Instead, I drove to a hotel on the edge of town, one of the few that didn't ask questions when a man walked in looking like a ghost with soot on his boots and a bag full of court case files. By morning, the story had already hit the local paper. Suspicious fire destroys home of federal judge. No mention of the HOA. Yet, but that changed by noon. Marla called me from a blocked number. Judge, we've got partial prints on the lighter, matches to Rick Mullins, and the surveillance footage, it's clear. We've already confirmed Karren's identity. She's wearing the same jacket she had on in your neighbor's doorbell cam from earlier that day. Is she in custody? We're bringing her in for questioning today, but I need you to know her husband's already making noise. He's got some lawyer out of Austin trying to claim this is all circumstantial. Then they'll love what I'm about to file, I said, reaching for my laptop. I wasn't just a federal judge. I'd spent the first 15 years of my legal career specializing in racketeering, property fraud, and civil rights abuses. My knowledge of HOA bylaws and real estate easement manipulation made me a nightmare for developers and neighborhood tyrants alike. I didn't need to wait for the feds to get involved. I filed a motion with the court to unseal an old set of complaints filed against the Cypress Ridge HOA complaints that had been buried in civil court years ago, when a whistleblower alleged financial misappropriation and retaliation against non-members. The case had been dismissed quietly. But with fresh evidence of criminal behavior, I had grounds to reopen it. I emailed the court clerk. By end of day, the motion was approved. The next morning, I showed up at the police precinct with printouts. Detective Jimenez glanced at the stack. What's this? Bank statements. HOA fund records, public access. They built a slush fund under the Beauty and Grounds budget, but the money was rerouted used to pressure non-members with petty fines, cover legal threats, and pay off a private security firm that never existed. She flipped through a few pages. How did you get these? Public records request. They forgot to redact the banking institution on the quarterly report. The routing numbers match a private account registered to a shell company in Rick Mullins' name. Jimenez let out a low whistle. That's conspiracy and fraud. And if they used interstate communications to threaten or coerce anyone, which they did, based on the emails I've archived, it's federal. I left her with the files and drove straight to City Hall. Councilman Darnell, a longtime acquaintance from my days presiding over municipal disputes, met me in a back office. I heard about the fire, he said, closing the door behind us. You all right? I'm not the one who needs to worry, I said, but you might want to sit down. I laid out everything. The illegal citations, the intimidation tactics, the arson, the financial trail. Darnell was no fan of HOAs to begin with, but this. His eyebrows nearly reached his hairline when I showed him the shell company filings. They've been operating outside their charter, he said, shaking his head. This could get us state attention, maybe even federal oversight. Which is why I need you to call an emergency council session. Today, I'll bring the evidence. You bring the vote. Late that afternoon, the city council chamber filled up faster than I expected. Word had spread. Neighbors who never so much as waved to each other were suddenly sitting side by side, whispering. A few of them had brought their own grievances letters from the HOA threatening to tow their cars, tear down their fences, or revoke their privileges, despite not being official members. I presented the evidence in 10 minutes flat. No theatrics, just facts. Projected emails, bank transfers, video stills from the night of the fire. By the time I was done, the room was dead silent. Councilman Darnell stood. Effective immediately, I'm motioning for the city to revoke Cypress Ridge HOA's charter pending full investigation. All HOA activities are to cease, all accounts frozen. And any attempt to retaliate against residents during this period will be treated as obstruction. The motion passed unanimously. As I stepped outside into the warm dusk air, a small crowd had gathered near the courthouse steps. Some offered handshakes, others just nodded. Then from the parking lot I spotted her, Karren, flanked by 2 detectives. Her hands were cuffed in front. Her pastel cardigan looked like a costume now, something worn by someone pretending to be decent. She saw me, and for the first time since I'd moved in, she didn't speak. She just looked away. I didn't. My house was gone. But the foundation I was building now, that wasn't made of wood or drywall. It was justice layered, reinforced, and fireproof. The courtroom wasn't mine, but the judge presiding knew who I was the moment I stepped in. Judge Havorson gave me a brief nod from the bench, then returned to his docket without a word. The arraignment for Karren Prescott and Rick Mullins wasn't open to the public, but I had been subpoenaed as a material witness, and the prosecutor had specifically requested my presence. I took my seat behind the prosecution table, not as a judge, not as a victim, but as someone with receipts. Karren stood in an ill-fitting gray jumpsuit, her face drawn and colorless. Rick was beside her, hands twitching at his sides, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Their attorney, a frantic man in a rumpled suit, who clearly hadn't expected this case to turn federal, kept tapping through his tablet like he could scroll his way out of disaster. When the prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Marcy Leeton, began outlining the charges, the courtroom air thickened. Multiple counts of arson, conspiracy to commit fraud, mail fraud, destruction of evidence, and criminal use of HOA funds for personal vendettas, she said, her voice steady. We have surveillance footage, financial records, and eyewitness testimony. The defendants abused a position of community trust to carry out a sustained campaign of intimidation, culminating in the deliberate destruction of a private residence. Judge Havorson didn't blink. Bail is denied. Karren's mouth opened, but her attorney quickly grabbed her arm. Rick's knees buckled slightly. Outside the courthouse, reporters huddled like vultures at a fresh kill. I avoided them, slipping out the rear exit and into a waiting black sedan. Marla Jimenez was behind the wheel. There's more, she said without preamble, handing me a folder thick with documents. We pulled communication logs from the HOA's internal messaging app. Turns out Karren wasn't just targeting you. I flipped through the pages, names, addresses, notes scribbled in shorthand. One read, force dues increase. Push foreclosure threat. Another simply said, scare them into selling. This is systemic, I said, scanning the rest. It's not just harassment, it's coordinated financial coercion. And I think you'll want to see this, she added, handing me a photograph. That's the maintenance shed behind Rick Mullins' house. The image showed a heavy steel door, reinforced windows, and a keypad lock. It looked more like a panic room than a tool shed. We got a warrant, she continued. Inside, we found a filing cabinet filled with original property deeds. Handwritten annotations, some with forged signatures. I felt my pulse shift, not from surprise but from confirmation. I'd suspected something deeper from the moment I saw how aggressively they went after my independence. This wasn't just a vendetta, it was a long-running scheme. You think they were running a land grab operation? I asked. Marla nodded. We think they were trying to force out non-HOA homeowners to bring those parcels under HOA control, the forged deeds. They were altered to include a revised covenant clause retroactively binding the owners to HOA authority. The scale of it hit me like a brick wall. This wasn't just about me refusing to join a neighborhood group. This was organized theft, cloaked in bureaucracy. I want to speak to the U.S. Attorney, I said, if this runs as deep as I think it does, we're looking at racketeering. Back at the federal building, I sat across from Marcy Leeton, who had already started assembling a task force. She leaned forward, tapping a pen against a legal pad. "We've got 6 confirmed victims so far," she said. "All of them former homeowners who sold below market value after months of fabricated fines and legal threats. Their properties were bought by a community trust that, surprise, surprise, Rick Mullins managed. Was there a paper trail? Oh, they tried to cover it. The trust was routed through a charitable foundation in Nevada, but the money always circled back to the same bank account. Same one we tied to the slush fund." "Then we've got enough," I said. "Let's file a RICO case." Marcy's eyes lit up not with excitement but with focus. "The moment we do, it's going to blow this wide open. We'll get federal warrants, seize all HOA assets, freeze every account." These people thought they were untouchable because they operated behind a neighborhood charter. They're about to learn what federal jurisdiction really means. The next morning, federal agents executed simultaneous raids on multiple properties tied to the Cypress Ridge HOA. Rick's house, Karren's condo, the so-called community resource office they operated out of a converted garage, it was all swept. Agents seized computers, file cabinets, and several large safes bolted to concrete floors. One of those safes contained a bundle of cash totaling just under $70,000 with a handwritten note that read, "Emergency Litigation Fund." Another housed a collection of burner phones, 9 in total, all wiped, but not beyond recovery. And then there was the ledger. It was an old-fashioned, leather-bound book, nothing digital. Inside were columns tracking payments from residents, not just dues, but penalties, compliance corrections, administrative levies. Some of these charges had been collected in cash, no receipts, no digital record. Marcy held it up during a press conference that afternoon. This ledger shows a deliberate pattern of unregulated financial activity coordinated by the leadership of Cypress Ridge HOA. Funds were collected under false pretenses and used to intimidate, manipulate, and in some cases, forcibly displace residents who did not comply. The room buzzed with reporters hammering questions. Behind Marcy, the U.S. attorney for the district stepped forward. Effective immediately, the Department of Justice is placing Cypress Ridge HOA under federal receivership. A court-appointed oversight committee will take control until a full audit can be completed. I watched from a secure observation room above the press chamber. I didn't need the spotlight. I just needed the hammer to fall. That night, I returned to Cypress Ridge, not to the ruins of my home, but to the community center 2 blocks away. It had been left mostly unused since the HOA had taken over all neighborhood events. Now it was packed. Dozens of residents filled the folding chairs, some standing along the walls. I saw familiar faces: Mr. Conway, the retired lineman, Miss Hallman, the nurse who'd found a violation ticket on her windshield every week for a month, and the Tran family who'd almost sold after their backyard shed was deemed aesthetic pollution. Councilman Darnell stood at the front, clearing his throat. "I won't waste your time," he said. "The HOA's been stripped of its authority. What happens next is up to us, but first we need to hear from the man who made that possible." I stepped up, the room quieting. "I won't pretend this has been easy. I lost my home. Many of you lost your peace. Some nearly lost the roof over your heads. But what we gained, what we reclaimed, is power. The power to hold people accountable, the power to say no, and the power to rebuild this neighborhood without fear." There was no applause, not yet. Just silence, the kind that comes when people actually feel the weight of a moment. Then Miss Hallman stood. "What happens to our money, the dues we paid?" Marcy Leeton, standing in the back, called out clearly, "All accounts are frozen and restitution will be pursued. If you were defrauded, we'll find it." Mr. Tran raised his hand. "Can we vote to dissolve the HOA permanently?" Darnell nodded. "Absolutely. We'll hold a special election. You'll decide what kind of neighborhood you want." That night, as I walked back to my temporary rental, the air felt different. The HOA had tried to turn community into control. They'd turned rules into weapons and power into profit. But now, Now they were exposed, stripped to the bone under the light of public scrutiny and federal law. They thought they were above the rules. They forgot who writes them. The day the federal receivership team arrived in Cypress Ridge, the air had the weight of a storm, not the kind that lashes your windows, but the kind that uproots deeply buried things. 3 unmarked vehicles rolled in before dawn, accompanied by 2 black Suburbans carrying agents from the Office of Inspector General. They weren't here to ask questions. They were here to take over. The HOA office, a converted guest house on what used to be Karren Prescott's property, was sealed off with caution tape by sunrise. A forensic accounting team began cataloging every record, device, and document. The lead receiver, a sharp-eyed woman named Evangeline Cross, made it clear their authority superseded any prior charter or board vote. Inside the temporary community meeting hall, residents waited in folding chairs again, but this time, not out of fear. They wanted answers, and more importantly, they wanted to see the fallout. I stood at the front of the room next to Evangeline, who held a thick dossier under one arm. She addressed the crowd without preamble. In the last 48 hours, we've uncovered over 270 violations of state and federal law carried out under the guise of HOA governance. That includes unauthorized property assessments, forged documentation of ownership changes, and the illegal transfer of funds into personal accounts. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Evangeline didn't pause. We have identified 32 separate residents who were targeted through fraudulent violations and coerced into selling their homes below market value. Many of them relocated under duress. We will be contacting each of them individually to initiate restitution proceedings. I stepped forward. For those of you wondering whether this is the end of it, no, it isn't. Not until every person responsible is prosecuted to the full extent of the law, and believe me, they will be. Evangeline opened the dossier and held up a black and white photo. It showed a document signed by 2 names, Rick Mullins and Karren Prescott. The letterhead reads Cypress Ridge Compliance Initiative. Underneath in bold was a phrase that made my stomach turn: Target List, Non-Conforming Properties. They created this list over a year ago, she said. It includes residents who were not members of the HOA, people who voiced dissent in meetings, and anyone who refused to comply with voluntary architectural changes. The goal was to reclaim those homes and bring them under HOA control by any means necessary. Someone in the back stood up, an older man with a cane and a trembling voice. They forced my daughter to sell, said her fence was in violation, fined her every week. She cried every night before she left. Evangeline nodded solemnly. We've flagged her case for priority review. She's entitled to compensation and criminal restitution. Councilman Darnell entered a moment later, carrying a small stack of forms and a tired but satisfied look. He walked over to me and handed me a paper. City Council approved the dissolution vote, 93% in favor. Effective immediately, the Cypress Ridge Homeowners Association no longer exists in any legal capacity. The room fell silent, not in confusion but disbelief. Then, slowly, a single clap echoed from the back. Others joined. It wasn't a celebration, it was relief made audible. Outside, the sun had climbed high and the caution tape around the HOA office fluttered like a warning flag. A team of DOJ agents wheeled out boxes, each one tagged with evidence labels. One of the boxes bore the name Prescott v. Ames. Inside were printed emails between Karren and Rick, discussing final measures and removal strategies. Later that afternoon, I met with U.S. Attorney Marcy Leeton in her downtown office. She poured us both a glass of water and sat down without ceremony. We're upgrading the charges against Karren and Rick, she said, tapping her pen against the table. We found a burner phone in Rick's shed with a deleted voice memo. Our forensics team recovered the audio. She pressed a button and a voice crackled out Rick's. She won't join, she doesn't get to stay, that's the deal, we torch it if we have to, nobody's gonna suspect a short, she's just another outlier. I looked up. He said she. Marcy nodded. He was referring to a woman named Dana Huerta, former paramedic. She refused to join 3 years ago. Her home caught fire a month later. Investigators ruled it a faulty outlet. I sat back, the gravity of it sinking in. You think this wasn't the first arson? No. I think it was the third. The DOJ was preparing to reopen closed insurance claims now suspected to be cover-ups. They were also preparing to indict a third party, a private fire inspection contractor who'd worked exclusively with the HOA and signed off on every suspicious ruling. By week's end, federal agents had arrested him at a rest stop outside Amarillo. With the legal net closing, more residents came forward, people who'd stayed silent out of fear. One man revealed he'd been blackmailed, with photos taken by HOA-installed security cameras, hidden in decorative lampposts. Another confessed he'd paid nearly $20,000 in cash over 2 years to avoid compliance litigation. The real depth of it came into focus not as a single conspiracy, but a culture, a manufactured environment of fear and control, where power was hoarded and dissent was punished. I spent the following weeks helping coordinate pro bono legal teams to assist the victims. A law school in Houston volunteered students to help with paperwork. Local attorneys with no love for HOAs showed up with clipboards and laptops. For the first time in years, the HOA's victims were being heard. One morning, as I reviewed a deposition transcript, a knock came at my temporary rental's door. I opened it to find Mr. Conway, the retired lineman, holding a worn leather folder. "Figured you'd want this," he said. "Found it tucked behind my old circuit panel. Don't know why I kept it." Inside were original blueprints of the neighborhood, dated and signed before the HOA ever existed. They showed the original zoning lines, property designations, and most crucially, a clause that exempted 12 homes, including mine, from any future association mandates. "They tried to erase this," I said, scanning the document. "They refiled the plat map 2 years ago without this clause. Then I guess you just found your nail in the coffin." We turned the folder over to the DOJ, who added forgery of official zoning records to the growing list of charges. The final trial didn't take place in our county. It was moved to federal court to ensure impartiality. I didn't attend every day I had returned to the bench, but I testified when summoned. My statement was brief, direct, and unflinching. When the verdicts came down, they weren't surprising. Karren Prescott, guilty on 12 counts including arson, fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering, sentenced to 32 years. Rick Mullins, guilty on 14 counts, 35 years with no possibility of parole for at least 25. The contractor, 7 years for obstruction and falsifying reports. It didn't bring my house back, but it gave something better: closure. A year later, the lot where my home had stood was cleared. The city offered to rebuild it using grant money from a fund set up for fraud victims, but I declined. Instead, I donated the land to the city under one condition: it would become a public garden open to all, maintained by volunteers. We broke ground in spring. The sign out front reads, "The Ames Garden Justice grows here. No HOA. No rules beyond kindness and care." On the first day it opened, I stood beneath a blooming magnolia and watched as neighbors planted herbs, flowers, and small trees. Children ran through the grass. No one handed out citations. No one checked fence heights. No one carried clipboards. They carried watering cans, gardening gloves, picnic baskets, and peace. The kind that can't be mandated, the kind that doesn't burn.